I want to see leaders asking what's important, and then, given that I've understood what's important, what used to be impossible, which, if it were possible today, would be useful.
The future of data is immense, and with all of that data comes tons of parsing, analysis, and decision-making. So with this giant influx in data, how do we make the right choices? We're so lucky to be joined today by Cassie Kozyrkov, CEO of Koyzr, and the founder of the field of decision intelligence. Cassie, thank you so much for being here.
I'm so happy to be here, David.
So you said in the past that data is pretty, but not important. And what do you mean by that? Because in my experience, data is foundationally important.
How I got into data and how I got into decision-making is the answer to this question. So I got into data because when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I discovered the most beautiful thing on the planet, which everybody knows, of course, is a spreadsheet. So this was an incredible find. And while all the other kids were outside climbing trees, there I was hoarding a data set and a gemstone collection. And the purpose of the gemstone collection was every time I got a new gemstone, I could go and enter it into my spreadsheet. So I found data to be very pretty and very soothing. Is it important that I do it for anything other than soothing and aesthetics? Well, that depends on what I'm actually going to do with it, as in, will it change how I move through this world? Will it change the actions that I take? Data is important when it changes our actions. It's through our decisions, through our actions, that we impact the world around us.
You have to be really discerning about the data that you even look at, right? And I think that's to your point. And so when I think of just a tremendous amount of data with very little discernment, I think of generative AI and the way that large language models are founded. So what is the difference about the big data challenges we have today with Gen AI and agentic AI than it was in the past?
So I truly believe that the birth of data and data science was the birth of writing. And what was writing for? Writing, it's a memory prosthesis, because you don't want to have to go to war with your neighbor about who owes whom how many cows. And that was what those original tablets were for. And that's what writing was for memory. It's a memory prosthesis. As the writing technologies got better, the data technologies got better, we could mass produce books, manuscripts. How wonderful. We had the ability to share memories with one another, and we can go back and read texts written in the Middle Ages, and we can get a sense of what people were thinking, what they knew back then, right? And that's all data. But the trouble with a book or a cuneiform tablet is you can't go, abracadabra book, how many A's are in this book? Well, you can. You just have to load everything into your human memory. You better hope you don't make a mistake. It's tedious, it's annoying. So when data is in electronic form, all of a sudden it is searchable, shareable in a way that having to actually load it all into yourself first isn't. But when we first started to be able to put data in electronic form, we didn't have that much storage space. Back then, because data were precious and storage space was precious, we would think very carefully about what we would collect, what purpose we would collect it for. And you had this sense that a data set that you would get, it's probably going to be valuable. As we have more and more space, more and more opportunity to hoard whatever we like, it becomes an episode of Hoarders. We have a world where, yeah, sure, we have for very, very expensive data sets, still think fMRI, for example, functional magnetic resonance imaging. That's expensive to do. And so if you're going to run an fMRI study, you're going to think very carefully about what you're going to do with your 20 participants that you have enough budget for. But if what you're going to do is collect a data set by scraping all kinds of things that exist on the internet, you're going to approach it as if, well, I've given you for free 20,000 storage lockers. Why should you think about throwing anything away? Why should you worry about what it's going to be for one day? What's interesting about generative AI is that the problem that we are automating is the problem of language understanding. When you think about getting a computer to do whatever you want for you, let's say you're inspired, you're a software engineer, or you're a budding statistician who wants to be able to do whatever they want to their data. Then you have to go and put yourself through learning an unnatural language where it has rules that mean very specific things, and you're very specific about what you can say, and there's a lot less ambiguity in it than, let's say, poetry. You put yourself through the torture and toil of learning this unnatural language, but now you can begin to express yourself with these building blocks. What's very important about generative AI is that now anyone, even people who do not want to put themselves through the masochism of learning a programming language, anyone can try to get something automated. Anyone can now make the attempt to ask for a computer to do the hard work of combing through this awful hoarder's storage locker. Now we can say, this is what I want, this is what I'm looking for, and potentially we would be able to have the computer do that for us. But the most important thing that you would have to do is to know what you want in the first place and be able to articulate it. And that is the biggest skill of tomorrow and the biggest skill in the generative AI world. It may be easy to get a machine without learning anything. You don't have to learn anything first. You can just ask for what you want. It may be easy to get a machine to do it. The things may be available because we have such abundant information. But do you know how to express what you want? That's the key.
So it's less about the data that it's being trained on and more about the way we interface with that data?
That's what the generative AI revolution is really about.
Can you tell me about the journey we had to take in order to now use AI as a tool as a species?
At first, what AI was a research endeavor to be able to pull patterns out of data. It was for being able to automate with data. And what that gives you is control. It's a matter of control. If we have enough examples, we can get something with superior memory to find and hold those patterns that we can't find and hold in an unassisted way. And for that, we're going to need a lot of examples, and we're going to need the hardware to move them all around, which is why originally AI was very theoretical. How would you do the mathematics to achieve this? And then we moved to AI being practical. How do we solve enterprise problems at scale that are important enough to automate in this way and are so complex that we don't already know the answer? AI has been about solving despite complexity, which is why when people say, I'm so uncomfortable with it because it's not giving me a simple answer, well, of course, if it was so simple, you'd have automated it the old way already. What AI is giving us is access to solutions that we can only get to via examples, not instructions, not human handcrafted instructions, meaning that it is an invitation to complexity. From a leader's perspective, it is one heck of a trolley problem, because complexity means that you invite risk. Anytime you have complexity, forget the question of data. Just you have a complex human system. Can you have the guarantee that everything will work out the way that you intend and expect? AI is an invitation to complexity. And so in some sense, it should make you a little uncomfortable as a leader. You are bringing complexity into your business. But on the other hand, all those problems that you cannot solve because you don't know the instructions for them, those problems are now on the table for automation. And there are so many unsolved problems that humanity just has not had any hope of making a dent in before we had the ability to collect and process vast amounts of examples and base our recipes on them.
Is it important for the leaders to have an understanding of the complexity behind these systems?
There's a difference between trying to understand the whole complex thing and understanding that the thing is complex, and therefore there will be consequences to complexity. Well, the thing I want every leader to understand is you are inviting complexity when you go for AI. So when I hear people wanting to be AI first, this is a big buzzword, what I don't want to see is at either the individual level or the organizational level, AI first, meaning how can we just have an excuse to use AI? When I hear that, particularly at the organizational level, then what I immediately want to do is I want to wrap that situation in bubble wrap. And I want to give them the least expensive, least important place to go do AI. For an individual, what AI first should mean is I am going to ask myself, what is important enough that I would want to improve it? If it's so important, I should want to get advice on it. You have to be wise enough to know when to take the advice and when not to. As with humans, you could get good advice and you could get bad advice from humans that you ask. Take the same approach with AI, but realize how cheap it is to ask. And so AI first is once you know what's important enough to ask about, also ask for advice from AI start there and then navigate along, continuing to use these tools, taking the good advice and putting the bad advice aside. That can be quite destructive if a leader gets into augmenting themselves in this way. Now they're an augmented individual, and they think that the same principles apply to decision-making at the organizational level. But the thing about organizations is that the choices that an organization that are made for a large group, those choices aren't necessarily very quick to rethink and rework. A little more responsibility is required there. That doesn't allow us to just do all kinds of things with AI. The kind of AI firstness I don't want to see at the organizational level is where we're asking, how do I put AI in my business? Instead, what I want to see is I want to see leaders asking a very different question. I want to see them saying, what's important? And then, given that I've understood what's important, what used to be impossible, which if it were possible today, would be useful? AI firstness for an organization is to kick down the door and have a look at all those things again, because yesterday's impossible might be possible today.
If we're thinking about big organizations that have their own, they're training their own models, how do they discern good data from bad and not just like go and hoard all the data?
I think we have to turn things around and take responsibility for how we're going to see the world and ask ourselves, well, what would it take to change our minds? What do we understand by the concept of truth? But perhaps more importantly, coming back to your very first question about data, which you may think is related to truth, evidence, facts, and so on, how does what you think you know relate to how you're going to act and be and behave and influence other people and change the world by being in it? And then you go and collect all the evidence. Then you go and find the good data. I told you I would land this plane eventually, half an hour later. You find the good data that you have said is appropriate. Now, when you start to see this type of framing, it becomes a matter of responsibility and trust as well. Do you trust yourself with your own decision-making? Would you like to delegate the decision to somebody else?
Can you give me an example, no specifics, of employing it in a practical scenario?
You start with the notion of what I'd call a default action. This is what I'm going to do if nobody tells me anything additional. In my starting point right now, I may choose to, let's say, not launch a big machine learning system, which is the type of decision that I would be involved in. I could instead say, with no further information, let's launch it. Which default you pick is a matter, again, of decision responsibility. Is it better with no information to release a thing? Or is it better with no information to not release a thing? So then you, as the decision maker in this big position of responsibility, have to say, okay, let's say my default action is let's use the previous version of technology unless we have evidence that this new one is better. Then we say, well, what is the evidence that it would take to convince me? How good does it need to be, the system I'm going to release? What would it take to change our minds? There's not one right answer to a question like that. It is a decision-making question. And that is why the discipline of decision intelligence focuses on the leader and the decision maker and the actions under consideration as the starting point. What is your mindset to? What would it take to change it? What are all the factors going on? What does it mean to automate with data and to do that responsibly and be convinced that you have made not the right call? I worry about words like right. I'm a little too much of a grumpy statistician for that, but a thoughtful judgment call.
In your day-to-day, do you ever intuit decisions and just be
all the time?
You do?
All the time. So one of the big principles in decision intelligence and sensible living is that you should first think about your priorities. And you should try to spend effort on decisions of an appropriate scale with what's at stake. The first thing you have to realize is that, what's that thing they say? Man is mortal. You don't have all the time in the world. You don't have all the resources in the world. And so you must choose and you must prioritize. And if you never get into touch with your priorities, you will float randomly through life. It will be like having no steering wheel. In many ways, decision intelligence is the steering wheel for your life in a technological world where you might be able to scale yourself a whole lot. If you're never in touch with your priorities, you just will achieve what life throws at you, you will be a passenger rather than a driver without any kind of steering wheel. Of course, because there is uncertainty, there are things that you will never see coming, there are things outside your control. Your steering wheel, any steering wheel you have, doesn't guarantee you a good outcome. Of course, there are things that I will intuit through all the time. I don't have time to be technical about them. And nor do I want to, because they're not important to me. And they could be so deeply important to somebody else, which is why we don't want to use words like right and the only way to do things. But when you use intuition, sometimes you're actually doing a really great integration of data, because we have evolved the ability to be pretty good in certain settings and at certain types of decisions. And when we slow down and we try to use a pros and cons list or spreadsheet or machine learning model, whatever it is, we may actually find ourselves worse at doing whatever thing it is than just going with our gut. Also, going with your gut is pretty good when you have a lot of experience in a domain. What you've seen is relevant to what you're going to make a judgment call about. You should be very careful about going with your gut when you're dealing with very important decisions in situations where you have never seen anything that could be relevant, that could have informed your gut.
So a lot of the decisions you make, you said, have effects, maybe wide-ranging effects. How do you account for irrational decision-making by humans?
So I actually studied in graduate school with Dan Ariely, who wrote the book Predictably Irrational, who popularized the idea that humans have cognitive blind spots and decision-making blind spots, right? This is the behavioral economics revolution, and I was very into this. I started out in more classical economics. I went to the University of Chicago for undergraduate. There, I discovered experimental economics and behavioral economics, which looks at how humans actually make decisions. And what we find, I remember this quarter where I was taking experimental econ and mathematical auction theory back to back. And I would go from the one class, the auction theory class, where we would work out, this is how humans should behave in an auction. If the auction is this style of auction, this is the optimal and rational thing to do. And then I would go over to the experimental economics class where they would say, and we've done experiments. And when you let people bid on things in real auctions, they do something completely different. I'm like, wow, what is the gap between these two things? And the gap is the cognitive reality of what we are as a species. We are well adapted to certain things, and we're more poorly adapted to other things. And one of the things, coming back to data, that we're rather poorly adapted to is having an ability to have persistent and reliable memory. If I show you 50 digits on a screen, I take them away, and then I say to you, what have you just seen? And, what's the average of these numbers? You're very bad at that. If you write it down with a pencil and paper, well, that's a tool that's better than you at memory. So data is both a memory and an attention prosthesis. If I told you that this was the most important thing for you to memorize, life or death, you would be able to keep all 50. You would pay better attention. You'd be more motivated. But without it, never mind that you've seen the information. What have you done with it? You've thrown it away. With a memory prosthesis, now suddenly you plus your tool are much better than you without it. And when we're realistic about what humans are and can do, then we can realistically begin to supplement some of our deficiencies while not trampling on what we are already very good at. So that's the approach that I like to see us taking, is what could we be if we were realistic about what we are right now, and we had technology to lift ourselves up a bit.
You take irrational decision points as a given?
As a given.
Is there a way to use data and AI to try to approach these decisions, these irrational decisions, in a better way?
Sure. And again, what is irrationality? I have very carefully attempted to avoid using that term. In behavioral economics, it's something very specific, but I much prefer to talk about cognitive blind spots, which is just, we are not omnipotent. You have the Enlightenment kind of putting humanity on a pedestal. You have science, behavioral economics, the previous century, kind of knocking us off the pedestal and saying, hey, you're an animal that's not perfect. You're not omnipotent. You can't know everything, process everything, do everything. I show you 50 digits, where did they go, right? You omnipotent being, you should be able to remember 50 digits. How hard is this? And what I would love to see with a decision intelligence revolution is us building humanity to a higher place, saying, okay, I get it. I get where we are. What could we be if we use technology to help us be better? So we have the blind spot of memory that's imperfect. Machines have the ability to supplement that memory in an incredible way. We can, as a species, share so many memories with one another in ways that were not possible 100 or 1,000 years ago. So how do we do that? And how do we do that for good? And how do we do that wisely and smartly? And how do we prioritize not just on an individual level, but especially those leaders who are responsible for things at scale? How do we serve our priorities wisely with a good blend of what humans are amazing at and technology to supplement what they're not?
Storage is super cheap and people are just hoarding all of their data, but we're trying to figure out a way. And I know I'm going to step on a landmine here by saying we want to capture important data. And I know that important is probably synonymous to right and synonymous to true.
Right. It comes back to priorities. So the thing that can be a hard pill to swallow is if you begin to embrace the idea that prioritization is an individual act, your priorities may be different from my priorities, then it matters very much whom we put in charge and where they then point technological endeavors. When we are saying things are important in a kind of universal way or things are true, it sounds like no matter who is responsible or trusted with the application of technology, we will all come to the same outcome in the world. But it does matter. We can fail in two different ways. One is you just have something that completely mismatches what you intended. But then you can also have the failure of having someone in that position of responsibility over the decision-making whose intentions are not what you would have wanted when you chose whom to delegate it all to. So you've got to balance those two pieces. It's not just about technically correct. It is also about how does responsibility work? It's about the who, not just the what or the how.
So the person who leads the decision-making process, they're going to prioritize some kind of data. How do you help them actually solve these issues?
The ability to think broadly and actually understand what you're saying and what you're asking for and the consequences of that and the little choices that are involved in things that you might say flippantly, that ability is something that, again, we can supplement with machines and we can supplement with technique. Let's talk about what evidence might exist. Let's talk about what would convince you to reframe how you approach that decision-making. Let's talk about what it means to, let's say, automate at scale whatever solution you're going to come up with. There are so many things that we can go and examine, pull apart, and put some structure under. If we don't realize that you can use technology to give yourself a better mental span and a better grasp of what you're actually pinning your actions on, then you'll miss the opportunity to do it better.
So let's say I'm a chief data officer at a big company and I just hire you to consult. How would you suggest I approach my AI data strategy today?
My first question is always who's in charge here, right? That matters. Who's going to be responsible ultimately for the decisions and how does responsibility flow? If you say to me that your users are ultimately responsible, who is responsible for how you integrate their wishes? That there tends to be a human. How do things get vetoed? Who actually gets to say what our starting points are and what it means to succeed? Who gets to make the assumptions? So I always start there. And if you don't start there, you may find yourself solving problems for someone who's not actually authorized to have an opinion. Next, after we've found the who, and typically there are many people, and decision-making is so much simpler when it's just you. When we're talking about decisions made in a group, there is so much to know about that. The next thing then is, how do we think about, again, our priorities and what's important, and in consultation with whoever this is. They'd better be in the room, because if we are just guessing about what they think is important, then we're actually making the decisions on their behalf. And would they like that? Are they consenting to that kind of decision relationship? That's also fairly important. Some folks, though the decision is delegated to them, would say, no, I don't have the time, effort, inclination, ability to deal with this. You do it for me. So we want the person who is now responsible for the decision to be in the room discussing some of this. Next is, what do they believe the priorities are? And how do we articulate those priorities? Once we have that sense, now we can do a bit of future solving. What might successes look like? What might failures look like? How do we articulate that and work then backwards from what we think is important and from the vision that we have about the world? And here, the vision piece becomes tricky. Can we put as much clarity into our most important decision-making as we can? Can we articulate as many assumptions as possible to really grasp what we're working with? What could we look at? What could we do? What are we trying to achieve? Whether that's for the chief data officer's stakeholders, or whether that is for the chief data officer themselves performing their remit. Now we can talk about what it takes to actually do the things that seem to be on the table and valuable, and if we have to choose between them, what we would need to do to make those choices. Sometimes all of it flows down into something super simple. If all everybody cares about is, let's say, being able to break down data silos, that's a very, very different approach from how do we prepare data effectively, cost-effectively for automation. Then the question should be, automation of what? And are we automating for ourselves or for others, right? All these types of questions. There's a whole lot of questions that have to take place before you then get into the technical nitty-gritty.
Isn't there a huge risk, just because the way that we're utilizing this data, of inherent bias? And if there is, how do we avoid it?
When we talk about AI bias, we're typically meaning algorithmic bias, bias that comes from how our lived experience impacts what we do next with information. What we think is important is a very individual thing that comes from lived experience, right? Which is why the way that I've been framing things, you'll realize that there is no such thing as no bias. There is only trying very hard not to be a jerk, which I think that if it's not possible to have one way of seeing the world, one take on what's important and what isn't, that everybody would agree on, what matters very much is whoever gets put in charge of those decisions, who's going to ultimately bring their own biases, is at least as aware as possible of what they're bringing, and is as desperately interested as possible in trying to make the world better and not worse through their actions. So that we can't fully unbias anything. The little things around what's important and what isn't, it matters who gets put in charge of that. We can't punt that to a tangle of wires. So I hope we choose thoughtful people who really try to have humanity's best interests at heart.
I feel like when you were talking about really excising all of your opinions when discussing, like when consulting, that has to be one of the harder
It's one of the
parts.
hardest, yes.
Like, because you have a process, you have an understanding, you're very data driven, you have a belief system on how to make decisions, but you have to prevent all of your opinions from affecting any of that.
Well, when I approach this, there are certain ways that a decision could be better universally. For example, if I can get more thoughtfulness from the decision maker for less effort, right? That's generally a universally better way. More thoughtfulness is better than less thoughtfulness, again, all other things equal. Pushing down where my opinion begins to bleed into the topic. That part is something that, yes, you have to learn and you have to have the discipline if you're actually going to advise rather than usurp. It's good to know when you're doing which one. If I'm going to advise rather than usurp, I do have to make sure that I'm capable of advising. But I will still say, well, you've told me that this is the most important decision you're ever going to make in your life, and you're about to take 3 seconds on it. I suspect that if you took 5 seconds, that would be better. In fact, I suspect it so strongly I'm going to, as a professional, insist upon it. Let's take more time, not 5 seconds, most important decision of your life. Let's take some weeks on it at the very least, right? Let's talk about how important this is and how much effort and resources we should be putting into it. How we navigate that, what factors we choose to look at and what factors we choose to ignore, well, that's on you. And when people think of data, by the way, as truth, data and memory, right? It's what we choose to treat as important versus unimportant. What we keep is as important as what we throw away. There is no sensor that captures all of reality, but there's still a judgment in where we put our effort, what we pay attention to, and how that then leads to what we do next.
We will continue to add columns to the spreadsheet. Just that if we're looking at trends, should we? Is there a point where we just say, you know what, we have enough columns of data? Or should we just always continually add more?
No, we spend so much time on philosophy, but we can also spend time on the beauty of data and what it really means to have this incredible shared memory prosthesis and this extension of senses. I mean, data is a sensory extension. You can see parts of reality that you can't get to unassisted without data. And it's beautiful that we are a tool-making and tool-using species. That's our history. We've been making tools and using them. And then we learned how to automate, which is tool use when you're not in the room. And that brings you scale. And so you can do what you could never achieve with just your teeth and claws. That's what's wonderful about us. And as we collect more and more data, we are expanding what we could pay attention to, what we could remember, what we could find important. And we can build the tools to expand our ability to look at all of that and to see it. We don't have to take data sets and read them data point by data point by data point. We can find ways to articulate, I want to know this, I want to look for this. And we can get it done with technology. And we might be able to do that faster than we can collect the data, which means that we can have such an interesting and expanded view of the world. But to do that, we have to start with what's important and what's worth looking at. And how do we articulate that so that what we get back isn't the number 42, to reference Douglas Adams? What's the meaning of life? 42. We have to be really in touch with what our questions actually are so that our answer can make sense to us. I've said earlier in this podcast that generative AI makes answers cheap. How fantastic. Quick, cheap answers. But if you get quick, cheap answers, you have to think much more carefully about what your question is. You have to really understand what your question is. For that, you can also use tools. And then you have to think about, was your question actually answered satisfactorily? Because that's not necessarily the case. So you can also use tools and technique on that side. But why would you limit, if you didn't need to, the size, scope, scale of the questions that you can be interested in, not just right now, when today is important to you, but in the future? Those people in 1,000 years' time will likely be interested in aspects of our civilization that it didn't occur to us to ask questions about. And for them to be able to get those answers, they will have to be able to look at things that we didn't know were important enough to pay attention to. If we only collect the data that we think is important today, then we rob the future of the questions that they will find important. So I don't think that we should stop collecting data if we can do it more efficiently and cheaply without ruining the environment. Again, there's always a trade-off, right? You can't have infinite data if it will create infinite environmental ruin. But what if we found a way to make it all worth it and to make that equation balance? How fantastic.
Cassie, genuinely, thank you so much for spending time with us at AI in Action. How are you all shaping the future for your decision making? Let us know in the comments, and please make sure you're subscribed wherever you listen to this podcast. We'll see you soon.